is, I'm going to start again. Now we have recording. Welcome everyone to the first ever Carework Recruiting and Retention Summit. I believe this is the second session today, and Jensen and I are delighted to be here with you to share some insights on this topic of scaling your home care business with data-oriented decision-making in recruiting and retention. We begin with a story, and the story starts in the summer of 2012. And I was sitting in my office and the phone rang, and a young man who I had known from St. Louis, Missouri, the chief operating officer of a growing and successful home care company, called, and he said, I'm on my way to Lexington, Kentucky to watch my daughter play soccer. I'm coming by Louisville. Would you be available for a few minutes to have a conversation? And I said, absolutely. His name was Andrew Huber, and he's the chief operating officer of a company in St. Louis called Martha's Hands. And we had a great conversations. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was his request to bring together a group of similar sized home care companies who would get together on a regular basis to share ideas, solve problems, and support one another. And that stimulated some thinking. And so that same year, my wife, Elizabeth Jeffries, and I, who had been in a mastermind group of other professional speakers, got our heads together and said, let's introduce the mastermind concept to the home care industry. And so in February of 2013, the very first home care CEO mastermind group met in Orlando, Florida. And one of the companies was that charter company called Martha's Hands. And the picture you see it takes place in their conference room several years later, when the top, what is now known as the top 5% mastermind group, had one of their meetings. I share this story as background because as we look at how to scale your business, and particularly how to use data and information to do that, much of what we have learned has come from these conversations over the past 11 years. We just had our 23rd top 5% mastermind meeting last week in Phoenix, Arizona, and we had some amazing conversations. And one of the things that we did was shared our own mastermind group benchmarking data to look at how we can learn from this other data. And so this whole notion of the top 5% mastermind groups lays the foundation for what is now the Home Care CEO Forum. We now have 5 groups, about 55 companies that meet regularly to share ideas, solve problems, and support one another. And so as we look at this issue of caregiver recruiting and retention, we begin to look at this lesson that really came out of these 23 conversations with these top tier companies. The biggest barrier to growing the company you want is finding and keeping the caregivers you need. And there's 2 parts of this. And so first of all, I challenge you to step back and think about, what is the company you want? If you could wave your magic wand, what will your company look like 5 years from now? And then the second part of that is, who are the caregivers you need to be able to grow your business, serve more clients, serve their families, serve your community? And that's what this Recruiting and Retention Summit is all about, is learning new ways, new ideas to attract those caregivers. One of my favorite quotes comes from W. Edwards Deming, who was an expert in quality control and statistical analysis, who said, without the data, you're just another person with an opinion. And so we're moving from opinion to facts and data to help you identify what you can do to find and keep the caregivers you need. We just completed some research for Access Care, the large software company serving the home care industry. And we talked about CEO pain points. And here's a list of the top 7 CEO pain points from 200 home care leaders. And of course, number 1 on the list is the caregiver shortage, followed by caregiver recruiting, caregiver retention, profitability, revenue growth, operating systems, and new client attraction. So clearly, this issue is on the minds of everyone in the industry. We also know from research from Home Care Pulse that the top 5 things that set agencies apart from their competitors is number 1, caregiver quality. And so this whole issue of developing processes and systems to find and keep the caregivers you need is really part of scaling your business. This graph represents what we have tracked over the last 12 years, 13 years of the caregiver turnover in home care. This comes directly from the Home Care Pulse annual benchmarking study, and we have tracked this each of those years, and you can see that it's been relatively flat for the past 7 years from 2016 to 2023, except for a little spike in 2018 and another spike in 2023. 2022, actually, from the 2023 report. We'll get the next issue of the Home Care Pulse benchmarking study in a couple of weeks, and so we'll find out what is happening. But this is the trend, and it comes as no surprise to you. The other thing that we have learned from the Home Care Pulse benchmarking study is that 57% of turnover happens in the first 90 days. And this will be important as we go into the steps that we're going to be digging into. Another piece of information that may be helpful to you comes from a dear friend of mine who is a world-renowned professional speaker and probably the world's foremost technology forecaster. His name is Daniel Burris, and he's originally from Green Bay, Wisconsin, but now lives in Southern California. And years ago at our National Speakers Association, Dan taught us about the 4 levels of your data stream. Raw data, which is bits and bytes of information stored in a computer. When we tabulate that raw data, we get information. But information by itself is not all that helpful. We're overloaded with information, but it's really the knowledge that comes from analyzing and synthesizing that information. And then we mix knowledge with gray hair and we get wisdom. So knowledge plus experience equals wisdom. And so what we want to share with you today are some insights about how you can take your raw data, tabulate that into information, do some analysis and synthesis of your own information combined with industry information to get knowledge, and then mix that with your personal experience and the personal experience of other home care leaders to get the wisdom to make wise strategic decisions about growing your home care business. Now, Jensen and I have come together to think about what we would talk about that would be most valuable to you. And we've identified 5 specific strategies that you can use to scale your business by analyzing your own data and comparing that to industry data. And I know that Rachel and her team have some great data that they have shared or will be sharing with you. And so we put that together. So we're going to look at these 5 things. Number 1 is to attract better applicants by analyzing your recruiting sources. Number 2, we're going to dig into increasing hiring by improving your speed to hire. Number 3 is to reduce no-shows in interviewing and orientation. I'm sure you all have a lot of those, by reducing friction. And Jensen has done a lot of work and research into this whole process of reducing friction. Number 4 is keeping caregivers longer by improving 90-day retention. Remember the data from Home Care Pulse, 57% of turnover happens in the first 90 days. And then number 5 is to use data to match clients and caregivers so they both stay longer. So we're going to dig right into this. And number 1 is to attract better applicants by analyzing your recruiting source. And we start with finding a superstar dedicated recruiter. All the companies we've worked with that are consistently adding more caregivers than they lose have somebody who's a dedicated recruiter, and some of them have real superstars. And we have looked at the characteristics of a superstar recruiter, and this is somebody with a sales personality who is a relationship builder. They tend to have a high sense of urgency. They are social media savvy and familiar with other marketing sources. They tend to be goal-oriented and persistent. Now, Jensen, you're out there, and I know that you have been working with some of your mastermind members and your strategic business clients. Talk a little bit about what you see in terms of these high-performance super recruiters and how companies can find them.
Yeah, so first let's make a distinction between dedicated recruiter and an HR generalist. You know, there's a lot of companies out there that I come across that have an HR generalist who is focused on policy, compliance, QA, and the recruiting. And it's two different personalities, really, that you're dealing with, just like we're stating here. I mean, that sales personality and to be able to get out there and network and focus on that is really key. So what we find, or what I found, I was looking through some of the data and some of the updated workflows that we've worked on, is when you have a full-time dedicated recruiter, it speeds up the hiring process because they're not being pulled in a different direction. Their number one goal is to bring on those caregivers and the people you're looking for. Um, because they're solely focused on sourcing, screening, and hiring those candidates and getting them working. In addition to that, when you look at HR generals versus dedicated recruiters, you, there's a lot of passive recruiting, meaning they post the jobs and then they react to the jobs and try to get them on the schedule and do that. When you have a full-time dedicated recruiter, we know, Stephen, we've talked about this for years, is that the caregivers that we want are already working, right? They're already working. So how do we get in front of those caregivers? And so when you have a dedicated recruiter, now you can start leaning into active recruiting by leveraging caregivers that are currently on staff, asking them if they have friends, family. That allows them to go online and do a little bit of research to see what caregivers are active in the area, to reach out to them on social media, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or any of these other platforms that are out there, to actively try and get in front of these caregivers that are already working, just to have that conversation. And so it's not a reactive, someone's applying. We're actually able to focus and go out and talk to our current caregivers and find people on social media. And they also have I think, the better ability to actually scale, and we talk about scaling quite a bit. If things are increasing, or the teeter-totter of clients and caregivers happens quite a bit. And if you have an HR generalist who is also responsible for this other big portion of the business, it's really hard for them to be able to set aside those hours or those duties to then really focus on that recruiting aspect, to increase the number of touches in that funnel, to increase your ability to get in front of more people to start them on services. So that's really, I mean, generally that's what I've seen by having that dedicated recruiter is really that focus.
Is give the sales pitch, because if you out there in the audience don't have a dedicated recruiter, we know that Rachel has a whole team of them. So talk to the folks at Carework, because they have a wonderful group of dedicated recruiters who are there to work for you. And as Rachel, as I'm sure told you, these are mostly spouses of service professionals, military service, and they're available. So talk to Carework about their.
And I would say this: anyone I deal with that has a HR generalist, I always refer Rachel and her team. Or if there's a recruiter that still is learning or training and needs work, Rachel and her team are just fantastic. We have a lot of members on their services and zero complaints. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, guys. I wasn't gonna say it. But thank you.
You don't need to say it. We're here to promote you, so we're happy to do that. Let's take a look at this recruiting funnel. And the concept here is you put high quality applicants into the top of the funnel. You spin out those who are not a good fit for your company with various filters, and you get a steady stream of high quality new hires coming out the bottom of the funnel. And so as we think about that, the number one element is to put high quality applicants in the top of the funnel. And so one of the things that we, again, look at industry data, and this is a graph right out of the Home Care Pulse benchmarking study from the 2022 report, and this is the masters category. So this is companies that are $5 million or more in annual revenue, and the number one recruiting source by significant margin is Indeed.com. And most of you are using Indeed or other online platforms. The second most frequently used is employee referral programs at 12.9%. Now, here's where the data analysis comes in. we take that same data and stop down and we look at caregiver turnover, and Indeed.com has the highest turnover of new hires by a significant margin. The smallest turnover comes from word of mouth referrals, and the second from employee referral programs. So we look at that and we talk with our members, and we realize that while online recruiting platforms like Indeed.com bring you high numbers of applicants, other sources bring you high quality applicants. And so as we look at this, we then begin to look at what we call the three-pronged recruiting process. If you're limiting your recruiting only to online, you're missing great opportunities. And so the three prongs of the recruiting process are, number one, employee referral programs. And we have lots of facts and data from our mastermind members and from other research that we have conducted that suggests that the highest quality applicants come from other high quality employees. And as Jensen said a moment ago, the absolute best caregivers in home care are already happily working for someone else. And so you need to figure out how to reach them. And one of the ways to do that is to boost your own employee referral program. We've done a lot of research on that, and we'll be sharing some more insights about how to make that work. The second part of the three-pronged approach is digital recruiting, and that includes Indeed.com, but it begins with your own website. So we encourage you to look at your own website and say, if I'm an objective third party, if I'm a potential caregiver applicant and I look at the careers page on your website, is this the kind of company that I want to work for? And then we look at other online sources, My CNA Jobs, Craigslist, Facebook, local jobs boards, and certainly online digital recruiting will be an element of your recruiting process, but it cannot be the only element. The third element is face-to-face recruiting. And this is where we talk about having that dedicated, high potential recruiter who is willing to get out of the office, go out into the community, and meet face-to-face with influential people who can refer caregivers who are already happily working for someone else. We've done a lot of research on this, and the four areas that we see the biggest opportunity are, number one, campus recruiting. And our research suggests that the number one opportunity there is four-year schools of nursing. And we have found that nursing students make great caregivers. They show up, they want to get the practical experience working with clients. You have to work around their schedule and the fact that they're only in nursing school for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. But the second thing is, once they graduate and go on to nursing careers, they make great referral sources, both for caregivers and for new clients. The second bullet here is about faith-based recruiting, and we've done a lot of research. And if you are active in your own faith, there's a big opportunity to reach out to your faith community, to churches, to synagogues, to mosques, to other groups, to make connection. And some of the data that we have gathered suggests that the best caregivers, and we've done 2 different best caregiver studies, the best caregivers range from 57% to 85% of best caregivers who say they worship regularly. Then we look at networking and centers of influence, and networking is reaching out to people that you know to get an introduction to people that they know who may be able to help you achieve your goal. And so identifying these centers of influence in your local community, particularly where your caregivers live. So where do they do their grocery shopping? Where do they get their hair done? Where do they go to church? Where do they socialize? What volunteer activities are they involved in? And who are the people that are the centers of influence? And then public speaking at church groups, at other women's groups about home care, and offering the opportunity for people to come and work as a caregiver. So these are the kinds of things that we have identified. And one of the things that came out of our top 5% mastermind group is this mantra that money matters more in recruiting than retention. And this came out of one of our mastermind meetings where we were talking about recruiting, and the member told me, he said, I was listening to the other members and this little light bulb went on. And he said, I realized that all of my recruiting ads were about the culture of our company and being a great place to work. And we never mentioned money and benefits and insurance and all of those kinds of things. And so he said, I went back and I looked at all of my ads and I redid my ads and I put out a series of job ads mentioning pay, hourly total pay, other money-related benefits, insurance, paid time off, vacation time, and I crafted a series of ads with the emphasis on things related to money. And he said my number of applicants went up by 400%. He said many of them are people we would not talk to or interview, but we did get some high quality applicants as a result of increasing the total number of applicants. And so we began to dig into this concept and found other evidence that reinforces this concept. So money matters more in recruiting than retention. We'll talk more about retention later, and realizing that most people don't leave for money, they leave for other reasons, but people will be attracted to a potential job when you mention money. Now, there are some data questions in each of these 5 sets that we want you to think about and dig into your own data to get the answers. So the first question is, what percent of applicants come from each of the 3 sources of recruiting? Now, if you're not using all 3 sources, then obviously your numbers are going to be different. But think about that. What are the sources of recruiting that the majority of your applicants come from? And then which recruiting sources bring in the most applicants with the longest length of service? One of the things that came out of our most recent top 5% mastermind group last week in Phoenix is that our members have shifted their focus away from recruiting and shifted more to retention and focusing on caregivers with high hours per week and long length of service to match with clients who want high hours per week and long length of service. And so using your own data is going to help you dig into some of these answers. The second point is increasing hiring by improving your speed to hire. And we define speed to hire as the number of days from when the application is submitted to the first shift that the caregiver works. And what we're seeing is that we really need to do what is called stop the shop. And Jensen, I know you were involved in this meeting out in Spokane, Washington, when our friend and colleague Jeff Weiberg shared this concept. Tell us a little bit about speed to hire and why it's important to stop the shop.
Yeah, so the concept from Jeff in regards to stopping the shop essentially comes from the urgency of getting in front of that caregiver as soon as they hit that application button. So as soon as you see that notification come through that someone applied, you know they're online, they're shopping for jobs. So pick up the phone, call them, stop them from scrolling, and try to get them on the phone and in front of you. And so we know speed to hire is key because, you know, these caregivers are economically fragile, meaning that they're paycheck to paycheck and they're always in, you know, one of 4 categories of crisis, whether it's transportation, housing, food, or there's emergency that comes up. There's always these insecurities that are taking place. And so the longer it takes you to hire, you know, knowing that these folks are paycheck to paycheck, the less likely it is that they're going to wait around for you to bring them on to start the shift. So whoever's first to get them working is the person that they're going to go with. So we've done a lot of looking at different workflows, and we talked about reducing friction earlier on. And it's really looking at, you know, how do we make this as simple as possible for the caregiver to go through this process with speed and get them in front of that client, that first shift. So I had recently worked with, I think 3 organizations. I'm working with one now where they had an average, you know, 10 to 14 day process, right? From application to first shift is what we consider that process. And so then in addition to that, now they have to wait the week or 2 weeks before they get paid. So that's quite a bit of time that they're waiting for that income to come through. You know, so we looked at the process. There's the application, and then there's the phone screen, and then you have to schedule the interview, whether it's Zoom or in person, right? And then now we're gonna require pre-paperwork, so we'll wait a couple of days for that. And then once you finish the pre-paperwork, then we'll schedule the orientation. And once you come for the orientation, we have to wait for a background to clear, and then after background clears, then we'll give you a shift. And it was just really long process. And I think what happens is sometimes, as long as we're getting people in and we're seeing some results, we don't necessarily question or challenge some of these processes. But the recent challenge I had with one organization, I just said, what's wrong with doing a phone interview and then go ahead and invite them in for the orientation. At the orientation, they're still interviewing for the job, right? So if any flags arise during orientation, you don't have to move forward. But you bring them in for the orientation, you put that paperwork on the backside and take care of the paperwork during that process. We actually looked into a different background check organization that got results in 10 to 15 minutes. It was worth the expense. After orientation, they sat with the scheduler, they had already cleared background, and they have their first shift and they're out the door. Another method for those folks who say, I need to see these people. When I'm interviewing them, I'm not just going to do a phone interview. There's another organization I work with that brings them in, but then they schedule the orientation on the backside. So they come in for the interview. If they pass through the interview, they immediately start orientation and still go through that same process of doing the paperwork, background screen, getting them a schedule before they go out the door. So we were looking at a 10 to 14 day process and narrowing it down to a 2 to 3 day process.
And so the more that we can use these step-by-step processes and automate your system using technology, and your scheduling software will have some pieces. If you have an applicant tracking system, Rachel and her team at Carework have a system that you can use. So there's lots of ways that you can use technology to automate this system, and that will help you shorten that speed to hire and reduce some of the friction that Jensen mentioned. So some data questions. What's your current speed to hire in days? And it's interesting when oftentimes we ask people that question, they sort of get this deer in the headlights look, like they hadn't really thought about it. And then what percent of applicants are no-show at the interview, at orientation, or on the first shift? And as Jensen said, the reason that people no-show for the most part is they're already working for someone else. And so if you take too long, they're not going to be available when your system catches up. And unfortunately, they're not going to call you up and say, sorry, I can't come to the interview. I already got a job. They just ghost you. And so understanding your own data will be very helpful to you. That takes us to the next piece, which is to reduce no-shows at interviews and orientation by reducing friction. And so when we think about friction, there are sources of friction in hiring and orientation. So the application process, what's the process that people go through to apply? Then you have the interviewing and hiring and onboarding process, and then you have scheduling. And so we look at where are the places where friction can slow the process down or make it difficult for the applicant. And Jensen, I know you've done a lot of work at this area of reducing the friction. So tell us more about what that is and how our listeners can reduce friction to improve hiring.
Yeah, my mantra behind this is just make it so simple it surprises them, right? Create a different experience for these caregivers and really think about the caregiver experience as you're going through the process. So when we had our quality assurance group, Stephen, we did a lot of exercises around reducing this friction. And I think that, a good place to start is to go through your own process or have somebody that go through your own process and give honest feedback on timeliness, how easy it was to actually apply and go through that process. And it was really interesting in that group. I think we had 10 agencies. And I said, okay, go through your process. And everyone said it's going to be fantastic. And of course, we have this down. Why are we doing this exercise? And we came back the following month. And I don't think anybody had any glowing reviews about anybody's different processes. So they kind of did it with each other's organizations. And we had organizations where the application was, 3 or 4 pages. We had organizations that submitted applications and they actually never got contacted back. Organizations where they got an email. They were never, I think only one actually went through an interview. Maybe there was 2 of them that went through the interview, but then things broke down because there was, again, all this pre-work. So it's really just look at it from the angle of what is the caregiver's experience going through this process, not necessarily what makes it easy for us in the office. And sometimes it does create extra work in the office, But in the end, what's the goal is to reduce the amount of work you have to do or to get those caregivers in there so you can grow and scale the business. And I think it's just prioritizing that.
Very good. So looking at reducing the friction, and then some of the data questions that you can look at in this section are what percent of applicants drop out while completing the application? And depending on the form that you're using online, it could be in your scheduling software, it could be in an applicant tracking system, it might be in your payroll processing system, or you might be using a Carework process. But the technology should be able to show you people who start filling out the application and drop out. And so figure out where the dropout occurs. The first time this hit me, I was working for a large hospital system up in Connecticut, and their home care company, and their recruiting went through the HR department in the hospital system. And so they had a 4-page application that the caregiver had to fill out online before they would even be contacted. And it was the same application used for nurses in the hospital. And 85% of the people who went to the application never got past first name, last name, email address, zip code. And so that led us to realize that we really need to shorten that application. And many of our members require in their online application only 4 things: first name, last name, cell phone number, email. And then, as Jensen said a moment ago, we will stop the shop by reaching out to them immediately. But if your technology doesn't show you what percentage of applicants drop out, then you don't know about the friction. Then what percent of applicants drop out before the interview? And again, the friction piece is, what do you require them to do after they make that initial contact, but before they're interviewed? And many of our members are, as Jensen just said, moving right from online application to an in-person session. One of our members refers to it as evaluation for placement. And it's coming in, meeting the people, doing background checks, doing an interview, going right into orientation, right into filling out forms. And as Jensen said a moment ago, they can decide during that evaluation for placement if this is the person that they really want to hire or not. And then,
Stephen,
yeah,
I want to add to that real quick too. I think it's really important for people to meet those caregivers where they're at. And so what I mean by that is, sometimes caregivers aren't available until after your normal office hours, or maybe it's a Saturday. And so what I've worked with the dedicated recruiters is, sometimes a recruiter will work on a Saturday and maybe not show up in the office on Monday morning, right? Because they went in during that time, or they stayed later and they came in the office at 10 o'clock. That's fine. The goal is to work around their schedule and not to have those caregivers necessarily work around your schedule, because we know they have other side things that they're doing to create supplemental income. So it's having that flexibility, I think, within your interviewing and orientation schedule is also key in regards to having people actually show up for those interviews.
the other part of that is the location of the interview. And many of offices in very nice buildings, and you selected your office location based on convenience to clients or public visibility, but your office may not be convenient for caregiver and caregiver applicants. And so it may mean that coming to your office is not the easiest thing for them, and that you may have satellite locations where you meet people, whether it's at Starbucks, at a library, conference room, at church, meeting room, wherever it may be. And so looking at how you can engage this process geographically where the caregivers are, as well as the time of day or the time of the week. And then what percentage of applicants drop out after orientation? And again, we find that often this has to do with the fact that they already took a job for someone else. They went through your application, your interview process, they showed up for orientation, maybe you paid them for that, but then they no-show on the first day of the first shift, or they call off because they're already working for someone else. Number 4 on our list is keeping caregivers longer by improving 90-day retention. We told you earlier, the data from Home Care Pulse says that 57% of turnover happens in the first 90 days. And so then it becomes the issue of, well, how come? And Jensen joined us in 2020, during COVID, after he and his partner had sold their company. And we began to look at this whole issue of caregiver recruiting and retention. We got this data from Home Care Pulse. And so we dug in, and as Jensen mentioned, he organized a caregiver quality mastermind group that met for 2 years. And as part of that, we dug into the causes of 90-day turnover. And the result was 3 reasons. Number 1, making bad hires. Number 2, paycheck balance. And number 3 is lack of caregiver engagement. So the first piece of this is selecting the best. Jensen, share what you learned from that research and from that Caregiver Quality Mastermind group about the selection process and hiring good applicants.
Yeah, I mean, really what it comes down to is really sticking to your values for the organization. We find that to be critical, like it's so crucial, because I think at times we will make exceptions to the rule, and then that exception becomes the rule, and the quality of those applicants actually go down. So it's really about knowing, I call it screening in versus screening out. So screening out is going to be your basic, did they pass drug tests? Can they do these things? And a set level across the board. But screening in has to do with your culture. So you're going to ask them questions that pertain to your specific values within the organization to see if they actually reflect those values. And as hard as it can be to not offer someone a job when you're needing those hours, in the end, is that person really going to be a good fit for your organization? Are they going to be a good fit for that client? Or is that a high risk where you can potentially lose that client based on hiring someone that just doesn't fit within your value system of your organization?
So selecting the best becomes critical. And then we look at the next piece, which is balancing the caregiver's paycheck with their weekly financial needs. And a moment ago, Jensen, you mentioned economically fragile caregivers. We've done a lot of research in this area.
Yeah.
Tell the group what we've learned there and how they can go through this process of balancing the paycheck with the needs.
Yeah, really, instead of asking caregivers what hours are you looking for, it's asking them, how much do you need to make after taxes to be whole? And what that does is, I think, a couple of things. I think it gives us a more accurate utilization percentage. For example, a caregiver might say, I'm 30 hours a week. But when they tell you what their financial needs are after taxes, that might actually be 32 hours a week. And if you're even missing those 2 hours, that's still them being short of being able to pay their bills and being whole. So I think it's really important to understand what their financial goals are after taxes to be able to take care of themselves and their family. The second layer of that, which I appreciate, is because now that we know that utilization is accurate, like if we don't hit 100%, these people are going to fall short of being able to pay their bills. The scheduling department now looks at it differently, not like, hey, can you pick up this shift? They can look at a caregiver schedule and say, hey, I see that you're 6 hours short of being able to hit your financial goals. Let's see what we can do to make sure that we can get that 6 hours for you, so that way, you can pay your bills. It's also a predictive metric in a way as well, too. If I don't know how many folks on here want to take a 10 to 20% pay cut, but if someone's consistently at 80% and they're not picking up hours, that could be a predictive metric in a way that maybe they're working for some other organization, or they're starting to move into some other organization and pick up hours there. And it allows you to get in front of those caregivers to say, hey, I noticed you're only picking up 80%, which is below what you need for your income. Like, what's going on? What do we need to do? And you can kind of get that backstory. If they are working for somebody else for an extra 5 or 10 cents or whatever the case may be, to recapture them back to get to that 100% utilization. So various ways, but I think really, if you understand what their financial goals are, it just makes it a heck of a lot easier to look at utilization in a way that we got to get there. And if they're not at utilization, we have a risk now of losing this caregiver.
And so as we dig into this more deeply, we recognize that when we have caregivers who want to work full time and they're expecting that full-time paycheck. And if their hours are short and they look for hours with another employer, then that other agency offers them more hours or to fill in the schedule, and suddenly they no-show you because now they're working a 40-hour week for someone else. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more deeply in just a moment. But this notion of balancing the paycheck becomes an important part. And it goes back to what we said earlier about money matters more in recruiting than in retention. If people are working the hours they need to get the paycheck they need, and if they have a good relationship with their supervisor and with their clients, then they will stay with you. And so they're not leaving for 10 cents an hour or 50 cents an hour more somewhere else, but they may leave if they're only getting $400 a week in their paycheck from you when they really need $500 a week. And so that's the paycheck balance piece. That takes us then to the next one, which has to do with lack of engagement. And a couple of years ago, we did a best caregivers study. We got 10 of our members of our mastermind groups to identify their 20 best caregivers. And we got those 200 caregivers to fill out an online survey. 184, I think, of the 200 filled out the survey. And one of the questions we asked them is, why do you stay? And the number one answer by 74.5% of those best caregivers was, I'm doing important work. And that led us to look at the people who do this work. And we realized that there's a large group of people that we call full-time professional caregivers who really want to do this work because they believe it's important. They believe they're making a difference in the lives of their clients. The second is, I feel valued by my clients. The third bar, I feel valued by my supervisor. The fourth bar there is a flexible schedule. I work when I want to work. The next is the education and training provided by my company. Number 6 is I feel valued by the owner of the company. And number 7 is fair pay. And so as we look back at all of these issues, we realize that if people are doing the work that they want to work, they feel valued and appreciated, and they're getting the hours and the pay they need, they will not leave. I remember a couple of years ago, one of our mastermind groups was meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with one of our top 5% members. And the owner, CEO of that company said to the group, one of the things that we've learned is full-time caregivers with benefits don't quit. And we were all shocked by that. And we went back and studied and looked at that. And they then began to share with us about their company culture and about how they show appreciation and recognition. And so then it becomes a matter of, how do we engage these people to understand their needs and wants and help them feel valued and appreciated? And that led to the development of the 90-day care plan for caregivers. And Jensen, you created this, so tell our group a little bit about the care plan for caregivers.
Yeah, so we know feeling like you're a part of something bigger than yourself is important, and not feeling like a number is a big deal, right? So, we called it the 90-day retention, and nobody wants to be retained. And I've been working on this for, it seems, a while, for a few years now. And the more I thought about it is, we create care plans for every client. And the reason we do that is so that, we can give them a great experience so they're happy, and we can actually keep them on services longer. So then I thought about it, and I said, well, if we can scale all these agencies with these care plans for clients, why can't we do the same for caregivers? And maybe it's not individual care plans for each caregiver, but why can't we have a set care plan or a method or some sort of structure that we follow so that we keep engagement with these caregivers? So the first 90-day care plan, we know there's a high risk there. So, we're really talking about weekly touches. And those weekly touches, you're going to have different people in the office that are responsible for it. So now those caregivers are feeling like they're a part of the team. They're getting to know the people within the office. And then we also included in this those paycheck reviews. which are key. So every time, you know, a paycheck comes out, you're able to contact that caregiver and kind of go over it to say, okay, this is how many hours, is this the paycheck you were looking for? Do we need to increase the number of hours that you're willing to work? But just making sure that you're having that communication with those caregivers for the first 90 days and that they actually have contact with everyone in the organization. Something that I'm working on now is the post-caregiver care plan. So how do we continue to keep engagement after that first 90 days so they feel like they're a part of the organization? What we found is, you know, when caregivers, especially caregivers who are with long-term clients with a lot of hours, they tend to start disassociating from the agency because, you know, those are your people that show up on time, the set it and forget it, and now they feel like they're working for the client, not necessarily the agency. So if something happens with the client and the end services, the loyalty is no longer to the agency. So what are things that you can do annually, biannually, quarterly, monthly, weekly to keep engagement going with those caregivers? So I'm actually going through a couple different processes right now with a few agencies and hope to have a good framework here soon for that post 90-day engagement.
So we'll continue to dig into this and continue to fine tune this process. And so some data questions for you is what percent of your turnover happens in the first 90 days? And again, when we have first broached this with clients, most of them don't have any idea because they're not gathering that data. And so we remember earlier, it starts with data that you tabulate into information and you analyze and synthesize it to get knowledge.
Stephen, to add to that, real quick, sorry to interrupt, to add to that, with that 90-day care plan, as you are tracking and people are accountable and signing off, if at any given point in time as people that are leaving in that 90 days, you notice it's occurring around the same week, then you know, okay, there's a part of this 90-day process that's not as impactful as we thought it was going to be. What are things that we can do to change it to create more impact and engagement from those caregivers? And unless you're tracking that, you don't know.
So if you know what your turnover is in the first 90 days, that means that you also hopefully have a sense of retention. And so then the second data question is, what are the sources of applicants who work 90 days or more? And so looking at each applicant and each new hire and how long they stay and how you found them. And what we have learned is that for the most part, the caregivers who stay the longest and where we have the largest number of caregivers who make it past 90 days comes from employee referral programs. And some of our top 5% mastermind members have put together amazing employee referral programs that pay significant bonuses, and they have shared that amongst themselves. And so there's this sort of internal humor going on because one company identified it, they share it with everybody else. Another company picked up on it, they tweaked it, they added to it. And then at this meeting, we were joking because somebody came back and talked about their 90-day or their employee referral program, and they were joking because they literally got it from the other member. They tweaked it, they made it work, and they were coming back telling everybody how well it was working for them. And so understanding how your employee referral program works and how it finds caregivers who will stay. We also find that networking in the community, the face-to-face networking and the word of mouth are other sources where you have high 90-day completion. Again, the data show that online data sources like Indeed.com have a relatively low 90-day retention rate. And then the third question, how does 90-day retention improve with a caregiver care plan? So if you put together a caregiver care plan and you implement it, what do you see happening in terms of improving 90-day retention? And what we've learned is, as you do the care plan, if you've made a bad hire, they're not going to stay past 90 days. Matter of fact, they will probably leave sooner as you implement this care plan. For those people where you have paycheck imbalance, the care plan increases that, and you increase the probability that the paycheck matches the financial needs, and so people don't drop out. And then this lack of engagement comes into play, and so the caregiver care plan meets that. So putting in place a caregiver care plan really resolves this 90-day turnover issue for the most part. And moves on. And if you can keep a caregiver past 90 days, the probability that they will stay for a year goes way up. And if you keep them for a year, the probability that they will stay for 3 years goes way up. And I'm sure all of you, if you've been in business 10 years, you have caregivers who've been with you for 8 or 9 or 10 years, a small number. What do we do to increase those numbers? And these are some of the things we're talking about here. The fifth point here is use data to match clients to caregivers so they both stay longer. What we've learned from our research is that there are basically 3 types of caregiver. First is what we call the full-time professional caregiver. This is a person who is committed to being a caregiver in home care. They want to work 40 or more hours a week. And so the question is not, will they stay in home care? The question is, will they work for you or for someone else? And so, as Jensen mentioned earlier, these full-time professional caregivers are happily working somewhere. If you want to add to the number that you have, you need to use some of these new recruiting methods to attract them and to bring them on board, and then to keep them happy in terms of their paycheck balance and in terms of feeling engaged and in terms of matching with the clients that they like. The other category we identified, and this is a little interesting, is what we call the half-time professional caregiver. These are professional caregivers who are going to do this work, but they don't want to work 40 hours a week. They want to work 20 hours a week or 25 hours a week, maybe 15 hours a week, but they will be loyal and consistent. They will show up when scheduled. They want their own schedule. They want to work when they want to work. But if you can match their schedule to your client needs and give them that 20 to 25 hours a week, they will continue to be with you for a long period of time. We find that there are folks in here like retired school teachers, moms of small children who want to put their child on the bus at 9 o'clock in the morning and be there to get them off at 2:30. And so they want to work from 10 to 2. And so figuring out who these people are, where you can find them. And the company that told us that full-time professional caregivers with benefits don't quit also taught us about recruiting these half-time professional caregivers. And then the third group is what we call the part-time intermittent caregiver. These are the people who work when they want to work. They are on Indeed every weekend looking for work. They're bouncing around. They leave home care and go to work at McDonald's, and then they find that's not so great, so they come back to home care, and then they go work for Amazon, find out they really have to work hard at Amazon, so they quit and come back. And so these part-time intermittent people are the ones that come and go, and you're going to need some of them. But if you can increase your percentage of full-time professional and half-time professional caregivers, you reduce the number of part-time intermittents, you reduce those no-shows, those call-offs, kinds of things that happen. The other thing that we learned in looking at research around clients, as we have surveyed clients, we find that clients want 3 things. First of all, they want a reliable caregiver who shows up when scheduled, on time, every time. And so reliability becomes key. The second is they want the same caregiver every time. We call that continuity of care. And you can only have continuity of care if you have a pool of caregivers who are committed to serving their clients. And then the third thing they want is a caregiver who listens to them, who adjusts the care plan to meet the needs of the client, the wants of the family. But the first 2 are the really critical ones in this issue of matching. And so if you can increase the number of full-time professional caregivers who want to work 40 hours a week and match them with clients who want a caregiver 40 hours a week or 60 hours a week or 80 hours a week, then they will both stay with you for a longer period of time. When client and the caregiver have great chemistry, they both stay longer. Words of wisdom from my son, Jason Tweed. Some of you may know my son, Jason, is 52 years old. He's physically disabled, lives in a wheelchair, and uses the services of home care on a daily basis. And so Jason has employed hundreds of caregivers over the past 30 years since he graduated from college. And he has really honed in on this notion of matching the client and the caregiver. And so this is a lesson that you can learn in terms of finding those caregivers who want to work, the full-time or half-time professionals, and matching them with clients. It also means attracting clients who want 20 or 40 or 80 hours a week so that you can build a consistent schedule both for the client and the caregiver. And so some of the data questions that we have: what percentage of clients get the same caregiver every shift? And several of our members have figured out how to use their scheduling software to create this utilization management process where they match clients and caregivers, and we have this continuity of care. Then we ask, what percentage of caregivers have a stable schedule with the same client? And how far in advance is your schedule established? If you have a big group of part-time intermittent caregivers, you don't have that stable schedule. You have caregivers coming and going, and your schedulers are going crazy trying to fill shifts tomorrow. And the companies that have full-time professional, half-time professional caregivers and are scheduling out 2 to 3 weeks find they have much less of this short-term scramble to fill open shifts. So these are some of the kinds of things that we have learned, and it goes back to my mantra. If you've heard me speak before, you've heard me say it, because I always say it: what gets measured gets managed, what gets rewarded gets repeated. And so using your own data to measure what gets managed, and also to provide rewards for the members of your team who help improve caregiver recruiting and retention. So measure everything and build your own metrics around the recruiting funnel, and use that raw data to gather information and to develop knowledge. And that leads us to the opportunity for questions. And we have 2 or 3 minutes left. So if you have some questions, feel free to type those into the chat box. And Rachel, if you'll take a look at the chat box and see if there are some questions in there that people would like us to answer.
Absolutely. So I know one question was, people would love to know if they can get a copy of that 90-day care plan for caregivers.
Jensen, can we share the 90-day care plan?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put my email in here, and
Jensen will put his email in the chat box. It's Jensen, Jensen, at homecareceo.com. Send him an email. We'll also send it to you, Rachel, so that you can share it with the people who have registered.
Perfect. Well, one we got was a couple people asking, when you're talking about asking the caregiver what kind of take-home pay they need, which, first of all, I love. I've shared that many times in reference to you guys, because it's the mindset of caregiver first. What does the caregiver need? And it's non-judgmental. I saw some people were uncomfortable, but it's non-judgmental. It's recognizing they have needs. And that's what matters. So I love it. But people asked, when do you ask that? And then also, do you ever have caregivers that feel awkward about it, or does it feel like a invasive question?
That's a great question. I think there's always that potential for awkwardness, but I think that the more we're open with people and say, look, you're part of our team. We know that you want to work, you want to do care, but you need to make a living. You have to pay your rent, you have to pay your lights, you have kids, whatever. And so let's have an honest conversation about how many dollars you need after taxes to take home to meet your needs. And if we can't give you the hours to meet your financial needs, shame on us. And so the only way we can do that is with clear communication. So Jensen, you're going to comment.
Yeah, exactly. On the front end, I mean, asking somebody what their compensation needs to be, I think, is pretty standard in any job interview. But what we found is people who don't know or don't share tend to be those low hour intermittent, like they're just picking up a side gig through the data sets, through our lifetime value data sets that I have here. And I had some ahas the other day when I was looking at it, and you see the same kind of thing happening with specific caregivers. And the problem with that is, as well, too, is you don't get that commitment. And those are just really high risk caregivers. I tier clients and caregivers: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And what I found was, when we're tiering our clients as tier 3, these are people who are on for a minimum amount of time. They actually cost the company money. And then we'll overlay and look at who are the caregivers who are a part of these clients that turn so fast, and you'll see a lot of the same names kind of come up versus that tier one client. You'll see these longer hour clients that have specific caregivers who are associated with them as well too. I pulled up the data set, weekly hours versus years in service for these clients and caregivers. There's one agency that averages 61 hours a week, and those clients were 4 years. One was 44 hours a week, and it was 1.7 years with that client. One was 85 hours a week, and it was 3.65 years. Another agency, 55 hours a week, 3.72 years. So these longer hours, and if you're matching it with those longer hour caregivers, they build these relationships, and they really feel, I don't want to say an obligation, but there's this connection with them that, I know what's going on with this person. We also see the quality of care going up because they're with them consistently. And so if there's a change in condition, they are more apt to call into the office to say, hey, something's going on with Rachel, and we need to take a look at this or notify the family.
And you asked Rachel when to do that. And we think that during orientation, and we like to see caregivers leave new employee orientation with a schedule for their first shift. And so during that conversation, to be able to say, okay, Sally, we'd love to have you come to work for us. And you've indicated that you would like to work 35 hours a week. So let's do the math and look at what your take-home pay will be after taxes. And so here's the, $17 an hour minus FICA taxes, minus income tax, minus unemployment, all the things that are deducted. And so here's what your net pay will be. And in order to get $500 a week or $1,000 a week, you need to work this many hours. And so we're going to plan to schedule you for this many hours. Does that work? And people see that we're trying to help the client or the caregiver meet their needs so that they will help the client meet the client's needs. And it becomes a win-win all the way around. And so it may be uncomfortable having that conversation at first, but the more that you build it into your process, the easier it becomes.
Yes, absolutely. And again, you take the emotion and the judgment out of it, that this isn't, oh, this person's all about money. It's the realistic, this person needs to make a certain amount of money to take care of their family obligations and to take care of themselves. That's a good thing. How can we make sure we're facilitating that? I love it. I know our time is at an end. We do have a break in the sessions right now. So Stephen and Jensen, do you guys have a few more minutes to answer questions?
We do. We do. Stick around and answer questions.
Perfect. So we're going to stick around and keep doing questions here in our breakout room. The next session is in 30 minutes. It will also be back in the breakout rooms as well for that. We have a great panel going on, more great training. But if you guys would like to stick around, I'd love to keep doing questions.
Yeah.
Love to see it.
I saw a question earlier about referrals and payments on that, and I do have some comments on that. So a couple things here. So when it comes to referral programs, the incentive has to be impactful, and it needs to be quick in payout. It can't be this 6-month, 12-month long drawn out thing. So there's a couple ways you can look at that. There's one agency I worked with that so that's one part, quick in payout, sorry. And then the other key part is to have advocates, ambassadors, or champions. So these are the people who are your promoters, your caregivers who are your promoters. You need to have relationships with those people because, if not only can they reach out to their sphere of influence, right, but they're also able to talk to other peers that are already working there about the program and how successful it is and the fact that they're actually getting paid out. And then there are also advocates for you as a conduit for like feedback. So basically, as their friends or the people that they're influencing to apply and work for your organization are providing them feedback, they're going to bring that back to you as well too, to help improve your process and that 90-day experience and post 90-day experience. But when you look at incentives, we have one organization that essentially has an ambassador that he goes out with that has been introduced to the church. So they're a bridge. So when we talk about faith-based recruiting, that's a great way of being able to either get into a community center or a church and be introduced versus just kind of randomly showing up and trying to work your way in. And people who apply for a position and show up for the first interview, he pays them out $50 cash. And then after the 90 days, they get paid out $500. So it's impactful. So there's an immediate impact with the $50. Here you go. And then you'll get paid out at the end of that 90 days. We also have another agency in our top 5% that has $1,000 payout. They pay out, and Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, they pay out 500 up front, and then I believe 500 at the end of 90 days. And then that person who was hired on, I believe, also receives, is it 250 or 500?
Now, actually, it's very interesting. The team has modified in that, and the members are sharing ideas back and forth. And so the basis is a $500 immediate payout, a $500 payout after 90 days. And then after another 90 days, the person who made the referral gets 20 cents an hour for every hour the new caregiver is hired.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, wow, that's a lot. And that goes on forever. But if you think about it, 20 cents an hour times 2,000 hours a year is $400 a year. And what they're saying is, we'll be happy to pay $400 a year to that current employee for bringing us a new employee. And what we've seen happen then is that, if you have 100 caregivers, you might have 8 or 10 of them that are actively involved in your employee referral program, but some of them are referring 6 or 8 or 10 caregivers a year. And so they're getting a lot of money from the bonuses from the employee referral program. It's not
Yeah.
everyone, but it's those who are loyal and committed and are very comfortable inviting their friends and family members to come and work.
And something I'm working with an agency on right now, again, having that ambassador is they're going to these churches and asking them about their fundraisers and things, because they're already doing community outreach. And that agency is actually getting involved with that community outreach. So it's building credibility. So it's not just somebody asking, hey, come work for me. They're helping with the backpacks and the fundraisers and the things in their community, seeing that they're actually making an impact, which is definitely helping that referral partner program work. Still in the early stages, so I'm collecting that data, but really happy about the initial results.
No, we love to see it. And for those of you guys who were on this morning when we were talking about scalable unit economics for the cost of hiring, as Jensen and Stephen are talking about these higher referral bonuses, I've talked to so many people who really get hung up on it. But when you look at the data of what it costs you to hire a caregiver from an online job ad, and then like Stephen talked about earlier, the difference in turnover, your referral budget can be quite high and still be a very scalable process. And that's how the agencies they work with are doing that. We love to see it.
We have a tool internally we use, Rachel, called the bad hire calculator. And you plug raw data from your company, pay rates, overtime rates, FICA tax rates, unemployment rates, and then it calculates what it costs if the person leaves in the first 90 days. Actual cash bad hire cost ranges from about $1,500 to $1,800 or $1,900.
Wow.
So you look at that 90-day turnover number. You have 100 caregivers, and remember, the industry average last year was 77%. So if you have 100 caregivers and 77 of them left in the last year, and it cost you $1,500 or $1,800 a piece, you start adding that up. Then look at the data from the employee referral program, and you find out that that significant bonus is minimal compared to what it costs you to have people leave. And that's where this analyzing the data comes into play to help you make that decision.
Absolutely. Again, it just takes the emotion out of it. Especially with referral and sign up bonuses, I see a lot of people that are just emotional essentially about it, and we want to bring it back to the data.
That's right.
Another question that I saw is, are people doing same-day orientation for virtual phone interviews as well, or just on-site interviews?
Yes, we have one organization in our top 5% group that actually they work in rural areas, so they do the interview and orientation all virtually.
Nice.
And then I mentioned we have another group company in that same group, and they have an in-person event they call evaluation for employment, and it's a whole process that's focused internally, and they do it live, and they just feel like when people come in and go through that experience, they get to know the caregiver applicant, and the caregiver applicant gets to know their company and their culture and their people, and they're able to feel like they have a good match then. And that shows up in the number of people they hire, their 90-day retention rates and their long-term length of service.
That's great.
So there's no
I'd love
one
to
right
see that.
way. And
Yeah,
that's the challenge with home care is, there's 26,000 companies out there and there are 26,000 ways of doing this. We're trying to figure out the common denominators that the best companies are using.
absolutely. And I think we're all united in the fact that we bring it back to the data. There's no one right answer, but there is consistent data that can help us with each client get down to the real strategies. We have a pretty long conversation going on in here in the chat, but a couple more questions. What are some recruiting tips for new agency owners who don't yet have a track record or a big roster of clients?
That's a great question. And I think for a brand new agency, for the owner / CEO to take that personal commitment to be that superstar recruiter. If you own the agency and you can be the superstar recruiter and you can get those first caregivers and those first clients and begin to grow and scale. Historically, the owner's been the salesperson. They're out there building relationships and getting clients, and they delegate recruiting, and it's a part-time administrative person or it's somebody else. And what we're seeing is a complete shift in culture. And I know, Rachel, you've seen some of this where owners and CEOs are saying, we're making a conscious choice to shift our culture from client first to caregiver first.
Yes.
That means as the CEO owner, my focus needs to be on caregivers and finding and keeping caregivers. And so back to your question, a brand new company, the owner needs to be the chief recruiter and the chief of retention. And then a lot of these other problems will get taken care of as they grow their hours and they grow their office team. Jensen, would you agree with that?
Yeah. Sorry, I was reading through some of these questions as well too. I was a little distracted.
All right.
No, I would totally echo that, Stephen. We do launch programs for new agencies, and one of the things we found is it only works if the owner does education and does it themselves first.
Yes.
Because to make those crucial recruiting decisions, it's very hard to understand how every little step adds up and can make a poor applicant experience unless they've done it themselves first to build the recruiting culture. So I completely agree with that.
Okay. Good.
Jensen, were there any other good questions you were finding?
No, I try to address some of them by typing in there. Let's see.
I see. Well, first of all, I wanted to point out, because we kind of went past this, but Catherine said they just had 2 caregivers celebrate 20 years with the company,
Huge.
which is incredible.
That's huge.
That's amazing.
So
And
congratulations.
That's the classic example of the full-time professional or half-time professional caregivers. They're going to do this work. The question is, are they going to do it for us or someone else? And when you create the kind of environment and help them feel valued and appreciated and make sure their paycheck meets their financial needs, they have no reason to go anywhere else. And that's wonderful. Congratulations. And we hope we can find more folks like that.
Yeah, and Angela has something here, and this is just going to be my opinion. It's about biweekly or weekly pay. I think weekly pay, just knowing that everyone is paycheck to paycheck, helps them get those dollars into to care for their families. If you're going to go bi-weekly or extend that, then I am a big fan of tap check to offer some flexibility to borrow from themselves if something comes up, for sure.
Yes, and this, we see the growth of tap check and daily pay and some other systems, and some of our top 5% members have actually created their own daily pay process within their payroll department. And then others are using those outside sources. So yeah, weekly pay, absolutely. If you and people have shown that daily pay increases retention, which is kind of interesting. But again, it goes back to this whole study of economically fragile workers, and most caregivers fall into that category. And the other thing that we've seen some of our members doing is providing educational programs for caregivers around personal financial management, savings, setting up IRAs or 401k plans to really help them be more financially stable. because again, a lot of the times when people quit, and particularly when they ghost you, it's because they've had some kind of a crisis in their situation, and they can't focus on work because they're dealing with whatever. And we call it the flat tire catastrophe. For you and I, we have a flat tire, it's a major inconvenience. For a caregiver, it could become a catastrophe because they can't get to work, they missed their shift, they lose that pay, they don't have the $200 to get a new tire, and it just snowballs from there. And an inconvenience to us becomes a major life-changing event, and they don't show up for their shift, and then they're embarrassed, so they no call, no show, and we never hear from them again. And so the more that we can help our folks be more financially astute, manage their money better, the more likely they are to be those long-term professional caregivers.
Yeah, and we've had members get really creative. They have oil change programs to keep the cars on the road. We've had members that have spare cars that they will let their caregivers use if something like that happens. There's one agency right now that's working on a tire replacement. So after so many years, I think it's 3 and so many hours, they'll actually pay for a new set of tires for their car. So people getting really creative to focus on, you know, how are we going to tackle the housing insecurity, food insecurity, transportation insecurity, and that the fact that if something big does happen, we don't have those emergency funds there. You know, how do we combat some of those things?
Absolutely. I love to hear it because all of that comes back to that caregiver first mindset. I hear both of you thinking genuinely about the situation the caregivers are in. And I know for myself, and I've told people this before, my husband and I have been through times in our life where we were very, very tight financially. And things like that can become a very big deal very quickly. And I think for people who are managing a roster of caregivers, it's very important to not forget that and to keep the compassion. So I love to hear it. We are going to have to wrap up there as we prepare for our next session. Thank you so much, Stephen and Jensen, for being on with us today. That was incredible information, such valuable time that we all spent together. So thank you very much. I would love for you guys to put in the chat any emails, follow up. Of course, we will be sending out a recording of today's session. But thank you guys so much for being here, and thank you for everything you do for the industry. I know I reference you all the time, and many other people do as well. You guys are doing phenomenal work, so thank you for all that you're doing.
Well, thank
All
you
right,
for
thank you,
inviting us,
Rachel.
Rachel, and thank you for kicking this off with your first. And I'm proclaiming this the first annual because we want to do this again. But also just know we're big fans of you and your team for what you're doing, and our mastermind members are big fans. So we're here to support you because we know what you're doing is making a difference for home care companies so that they can find more caregivers, so they can serve more clients, and so they can scale their businesses. So
Thank you.
It's a mutual love fest here, right?
It really
Yeah.
is. Well, thank you guys. For everyone attending, we will be back in 10 minutes for the next session. If you are coming back to the leadership track, we will reopen the breakout rooms. You can go back to the main session if you want to navigate over to the recruiter track as well. And we will see you guys in 10 minutes. Thank you guys again.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye,
Appreciate it.
everybody.
Bye.